Morning, Nolan, Bitcoiner. Another episode of The Breakup, a show where we take a look at our relationship with money and contrast the world built off of the US dollar and the relationship we have with the US dollar, and contrast that relationship with what's possible with Bitcoin, what's currently present with Bitcoin, and what we're going to build with Bitcoin. So it's about the relationship. It's not a show about why you should trade your dollars for Bitcoin. It's about the psychology behind each of these um, really in the end measuring sticks for the economy, right? These are not so much about the relative value of each. It's about the psychology that goes behind them and what they can perpetuate forward afterwards. So it's not a debate between Austrian school, modern monetary theory, Keynesian. You hear all this stuff a lot on Bitcoin Twitter and other places. That's not the content for here. It's not a fight about economists. It's a debate about the psychology behind each of these systems. And the point of this show is to underline why you should break up with the US dollar and your relationship with the institutions that perpetuate the US dollar. Today's is one of the stupidest institutions you could think of, the Bank Secrecy Act. So this has been around basically since the US dollar got off the gold standard and went full fiat, as we say. 1971 was when the Nixon shock it was called, decided to pull the US dollar out of its redeemable market for gold because other countries were draining US. I mean, there were their own reserves, but there was a whole issue of people calling their gold back. Once they felt that World War II and the reasons for which they put the gold in America in the first place were kind of over. So France and Germany and these places started pulling the gold back. Nixon couldn't handle it for great reasons, and stopped the redeemability of U.S. dollar for gold and created an era where the U.S. dollar became the measuring stick of all financial output in the world, and therein becomes the problem. So Bank Secrecy Act happened around that time, and the Bank Secrecy Act, you'll know it as the anytime you sign that $10,000 declaration when you're traveling across borders, for example, you're on a flight and you say, "Oh, do you have $10,000 on you?" No. So, or yes, the $10,000 requirement, that reporting requirement, is a major feature of the Bank Secrecy Act. What the Bank Secrecy Act basically is the deputization by law enforcement of the banks. Remember, it's the deputization of the banks by law enforcement, right? So law enforcement, if you even think of the Al Capone times, right? Al Capone, how did they get Al Capone in the end, right? How did they get him? They got him on the taxes, right? You hear that a lot, taxes, right? They didn't go catch him. They went into his financial dealings and caught him that way. And that's been a great lesson for all sorts of law enforcement agents afterwards. And in the 1970s, it went sort of full born that way, right? It wasn't just go to the IRS and look at tax documents and compare them to cash flow. Um, the law actually deputized, made it the banks responsible for this. So to this day, the banks must find this stuff if they can, um, and they'll get a fine if they don't act in accordance. And there's a ton of fines over the years with all kinds of major banks doing this very deliberately, getting around the Bank Secrecy Act because of preferred clients and things like that. HSBC is one of the largest, um, infraction, the people who do it the most, one of the worst banks for it. A bunch of others. We're not going to go through all of them now. But this whole thing is actually what got me into Bitcoin personally. I was doing a study for the Senate of Canada, Senate Banking Committee in Canada in 2012 on money laundering. And it was this whole regime, and what they were asking us for in Canada was the reporting requirement to come even lower, so almost all financial transactions would be reported to them. And at first I said, well, what's all this about? Why are they asking for more? What do they get done? And so in the end, I discussed it with our executive branch, with the Prime Minister's office, and with what in America you would think of as the Treasury Department, our own Treasury Department. And I discussed it with both of them. And both of them were of the mind that our version of the Bank Secrecy Act in Canada was going too far, had gone too far. The international regime around it wasn't really getting the job done. I didn't know much of this, but then I started to research it. And in the end, I got both parties in our Senate, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, to be furious with these folks, because not only were they asking for the reporting requirements to be lowered, they actually weren't prosecuting anyone. So they have all of these laws and all of these compliance measures, and they don't actually prosecute anyone. It was interesting for us politically because in Canada, one of the major differences in Canadian federalism and U.S. federalism is banks. Banks are federally regulated, federally legislated, very deliberate. Canada needed to survive what America was growing into after the Civil War, and it looked like they were going to grow north. And so Canada, England said, we're not going to pay your bills anymore. We saw those machine guns they used in the Civil War. We're not fighting them again, so you're on your own. And so Canada had to find a way to finance infrastructure, in particular railroads that went east-west, not the private ones going north-south, which were being developed by all kinds of U.S. rails. So the banks became regulated federally. The loophole became these co-ops that came up later are all state bank. What you would think of in the United States as a state bank. So we have these state co-ops, provincial co-ops. And they cannot corporatize compliance the way a bank can. So they can't just send it all to the main office in New York or whatever. In the case of Canada, Toronto, they've got to deal with it at the branch. And so these branches were hiring compliance officers, not loan officers. And that was a major problem politically, especially because a lot of this Bank Secrecy Act plugs into something called FATF, which is a Parisian organization that really runs a lot of the regime globally. They name and shame. So people who don't adhere to the standards of Bank Secrecy Act and other institutions like FinCEN, FinTrack, and all the others in the world will get named and shamed. It got so bad that, believe it or not, it's the reason why the Western countries lost Hong Kong. Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, the CEO of Hong Kong, would cite as the reason that they required extradition powers to China, right? So they required extradition powers to China, which is how this whole Hong Kong protest movement began. Because if you had extradition from Hong Kong to China, you could apply Chinese law to any Hong Konger, therefore, completely taking away the jurisdictional freedom that Hong Kong enjoyed. So it would just make it sort of mute. The precursor, the reason why Carrie Lam could say that was because the FATF institutions in Paris around this bank secrecy stuff had singled out Hong Kong as mischievous state, and its lack of extradition to mainland China was the main culprit and would fix the problems. Convenient that China was running FATF at the time. They were the president of FATF. It's a rotating presidency that goes between member states, and it was China's turn. Its first order of business, 2019, was to push for this. And of course it worked because Hong Kong is now China. It is no longer a separate sovereign state, as evidenced by all form of financial institutions leaving because these Bank Secrecy Acts now apply to them. And extradition is real. So I learned about it because, basically we politically figured out it was quite useless, was doing nothing, and we could destroy it and no one would notice because it wasn't actually solving anything. Now, the Bank Secrecy Act, as I said, deputizes banks. So they're the main actor here. A suspect comes in, they get their address, social security, phone number, they check the financial history and the counterparties. And it's these pieces here that allow them to either allow the transaction or call the police. Now, you'd think call the police would be an important part of that. In fact, it almost never happens, right? So they're just collecting all this data, doing all this compliance. They don't actually catch anyone or catch people very often. Now, this is a problem because we start to see things like the story written yesterday, which is that the White House is deciding that art collections should fall under this same Bank Secrecy Act. So currently, Sotheby's, Christie's, a lot of the big art houses have a voluntary compliance thing, but they're not actually subject to this law. So the way it works is you can buy a piece of art, for example, in Switzerland, and you can leave that piece of art in a free port. So these are expensive vaults, for example, where you can put tax-free art into it and ship it to where it needs to go next. what happens is you can make transactions when it's in these free ports. So you buy the art, you put it in the free port, you sell it, no financial reporting has taken place, yet the financial transactions themselves look like legitimate business. We see it in crypto very often because a lot of these crypto punks and other things have been used in wash trades. So I've seen a few crypto punks bought for $500 million. Really, the crypto punk is not selling for $500 million. You're trying to create a legitimate business line for that amount of money, and you buy the crypto punk, and therefore you have like a receipt, right? You can start saying it's legitimate. Now, the Bank Secrecy Act doesn't apply to art. It doesn't apply to art galleries. It doesn't apply to these art things. So the White House has come out and said, we want this to apply, right? We want this to apply. So once again, right, they've got all this stuff going for the banks. They don't catch money launderers. Well, I wonder why, right? You can do things like this whole art industry and get away with it, right? So they have this whole thing built up. They're looking at all banks, all transactions, all people, but they aren't actually catching people, right? So the whole thing steers traffic to things like art. Now you can see right away that no one has ever been caught for money laundering in art because the rules don't apply. Here's a quote from a American regulator with the Department of Homeland Security. So a former regulator with the Department of Homeland Security, Special Agent James McAndrew said, "There has not been an art dealer or collector convicted for laundering money through art." So it's never happened, right? But then you've got this fellow, Thomas Christ, a board member of the Basel Institute of Governance, saying the art market is an ideal playing ground for money laundering, right? So everyone knows it's ideal. They've never prosecuted anyone. They never prosecute anyone through the Bank Secrecy Act when they actually try to catch them doing it through banks. So what does that tell you? Is there's either no money laundering in the world, or it's all going through art and a few other things like art, right? So it's not just art. So they don't go through the front door. There's this obvious side door that people go through. Okay, great. Well, why does this matter? And then they're not catching anyone in the banks, and they're not catching anyone. The reason why, and now the White House is saying they're going to do it. Well, they also had to defend at the White House why they haven't done it so far. And this is a really interesting piece. So Hunter Biden, the son of the president, recently declared he was an artist and started creating all of this art, right? And I know it's not so bad, actually. I've gone to look at it. So I'm not here to say whether Hunter is a good artist or not. He's not that bad, honestly. I wouldn't buy it. I wouldn't pay $5 for most art. It's all terrible as far as I can tell. There's nice pieces out there, of course, but most of that crap, it's just blown stuff and it doesn't make any sense and blah blah blah. Anyway, not my style. Wouldn't put it up anywhere. Looks like the stuff my children make. Frankly, looks like the stuff my children make, but that's also beautiful, right? So they're saying at the White House that they don't need to pay attention to Hunter Biden's potential for money laundering with art because he's an artist now, right? So the new thing they're talking about, closing down money laundering for art dealers, which we've just discussed, doesn't apply to Hunter, right? It doesn't apply to Hunter. Hunter is somehow beyond that. So what's really important to start considering when you see that, it's definitely happening. Here's an example of how we know it's happening. Mexico, 2010. The country of Mexico decides to get rid of the anonymity of finances with art, right? And so the market ends up crashing almost completely, right? Almost completely, 80% down. The reason why it was down so much is simple. The cartels themselves were laundering money by buying the art. And once they made it no longer a viable opportunity, so we know it's a big part, right? Yet no one has ever been caught. So we know it's a big part, yet no one has ever been caught. The minute I saw Hunter Biden, so I have a background, right? So I've mentioned that I worked with the Senate Banking Committee. That's how I got into Bitcoin. I learned about Bitcoin in that study and got the Senate to do a 2013 study on Bitcoin, and I've been totally involved in Bitcoin ever since. And this Bank Secrecy Act piece has always seemed to me the stupidest thing in the world because it doesn't work. Yet it's still a major impediment to Bitcoin. Banks, you got to comply, you got to do this. We just lost Hong Kong for the same reasons that Bitcoin, exchanges and all these folks need licenses, right? So it didn't do Hong Kong any good, right? We're willing to, literally sacrifice an important beacon of Western, national systems, really, right? Because it was a common law system. That was the best part of Hong Kong, is that it was not Communist Party law. It was common law, right? It was a great tradition of law. Totally gone, right? Totally gone. Habeas corpus, the taking of the body is gone. You can be taken to China without due process now. So Hong Kong is no longer part of the gang. And Bitcoin has to overcome these same headwinds, yet no one ever asks if these headwinds are even worth it in the first place, right? Because these folks are getting away with it. Now, in the case of Hunter Biden, there's a separate issue that's really tough, which is that Hunter has been accused of selling access to his dad based on that laptop that was suppressed by Twitter and YouTube and Facebook, or discussion of the laptop when it was found, as Russian disinformation, right? So within there, they talked about influence peddling and access peddling, that Hunter Biden was selling to people around the world, selling access to his father. And the minute I saw the art story, I mean, someone who has a background said that's money laundering. I mean, how come no one's talking about this? All those first stories in the newspaper, oh, Hunter Biden, he's an artist now. I said, whoa, 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 whoa. Money laundering. Obviously money laundering. This is just the same thing as before. This is the same as the access, selling access to the vice president, right? When Hunter was vice president. Now, so the White House is saying that they've released a report that the art market is ripe for financial corruption. We've known that. We've all known that. Yet they claim that Hunter is immune from it, right? It looks like one of those access stories again. And here's the breakup part, right? Here's why we need to break up with them. It's not so much that the media is not challenging the deception, right? It's not so much that the media isn't challenging what Hunter is saying, what the White House is saying. It's that they're actively coordinating to become a part of the deception, it would appear, right? So celebrating Hunter Biden as an artist, either you're a rock bottom stupid journalist, which is possible. I don't want to neglect that these folks are probably rock bottom stupid. So let's not say that's a 0% chance, right? They could very well be. That's maybe even the reason, rock bottom stupid journalists, right? But the other part is, if they're not rock bottom stupid, they're liars. They have to be deceptive. They have to be running fluff pieces about why Hunter Biden is an artist and why this isn't influence peddling and access. And Jonathan Turley is a great writer, runs a great blog, underlines this as one of the reasons why it's so difficult, because, and I'll read what he says, all of these facts about Hunter and access that he sold with companies in China and Ukraine and all these places. What Jonathan Turley says is none of these facts can force the media to see the elephant in the room, which is all these things that are happening. The key to the trick was involving the media in the original trick, is that it invests reporters in the illusion. It's like calling audience members to the stage to assist in the performance. Reporters have to insist that there was nothing to see, or they have to admit being part of the original deception. The media cannot see the elephant without the public seeing something about the media in its past efforts to conceal it, right? And this becomes even more important. So media called in, right? Active deception, which is what I'm arguing, right? I'm arguing that everybody knows the Bank Secrecy Act is stupid and doesn't work and they don't catch anyone. Everybody knows the art industry is used for this, right? To get around. If the White House comes out and says they're planning on closing the loop and then says, but Hunter Biden is immune and it's not really our concern, right? Surely you have to see any writer or media outlet that's playing along with this as actively deceptive, right? You can't really give them the benefit of the doubt of being stupid, even though that might be the case. But here's where it gets even worse, right? So forget about Bank Secrecy Act, forget about White House, forget about the art market, Hunter Biden, everything. Also yesterday, right? The White House briefing with major newsrooms over the past week as they try to reshape all of our reshape economic coverage. Um, so the White House, not happy with the news media's coverage of the supply chain and the economy, has been working behind the scenes trying to reshape coverage in its favor. Senior White House officials, the NEC deputy director, have been briefing major newsrooms over the past week. Right? I'm told the conversations have been productive with anchors and reporters and producers getting to talk with the officials. Now, Glenn Greenwald, who we love on this show, Glenn Greenwald is, the best. Glenn Greenwald says, media corporations meeting in secret with White House officials to discuss how to present a more optimistic view of Biden's economic policies seems to me a bit more like state TV. But I'm glad and unsurprised to hear that from CNN, that the conversations have been productive. So the conversations, it's like conversation. You hear about negotiations, to some important thing. Conversations have been productive. That would have been like warp speed for the vaccine in the early days or something. Conversations have been productive. We're literally talking here about propaganda from the White House being aligned with media outlets, and they're out front saying the conversations have been productive. The plans on what to tell you about the things you're seeing are going well, right? So if that's not a reason to break up with the US dollar system and with the people behind it, right? The psychology perpetuating the system forward forces you to listen, first of all, to CNN and the idiots on it talking about nonsense, and then forces you to have no problem with this being coordinated, and then forces you to have no problem with this coordination being absolutely beneficial to a family member of one of them. That's why we got to break up. That's why, essentially making law enforcement go back to its job of catching criminals and not getting other people like banks to spy on your financial transactions so that they can, pick winners and losers and who to prosecute is just not the way forward, right? That's why we have to embrace a better psychological engine for our economy, which is Bitcoin. That's it for today, everyone. Thanks a lot.